Well, we've picked up quite a few different techniques along the way so far. Now what I want to do in this tutorial is implement some of those techniques, and in particular I want to look at using compression, which we did look at somewhat casually a couple of tutorials ago, and I also want to show you how I've built up this track list by implementing one of the clips with its embedded audio, and remember the audio is the live recording in the rehearsal room, and I've also got the isolated vocal file, and that's on track 3, and finally on track 4 I've got the studio recording, or at least part of it anyway. And I've taken some time and positioned them so that they all run in synchronization. So just as a reminder of what we've got and what things sound like and look like, I'm going to mute the isolated vocal file on track 3 by clicking on there, and that mutes the audio playback, and I'll also do the same thing for our studio recording. So now, of course, if I click play, all we're going to see is the video playing back. We're not actually going to hear anything. Okay, well that's fine for the moment. Of course I don't want that in my final video. And in actual fact, I'm not building up my final video by doing this. Remember in the last couple of tutorials where we talked about building up separate sections that we could use for a biography? Well, possibly I'm going to use this section for Zach the singer with his biographical details on screen. So when the end user is watching through the DVD, they can flick through to the end and see this small section with Zach's biographical details. Okay, now I'll just move my CTI over here, and you'll notice that at this position, just by looking at the audio track 2 there, that the recording in the rehearsal room now comes into play once more. Let's just have a quick listen. Here we go. Okay, a very lively recording there in the rehearsal room. Now, if we compare this with the actual recording in the studio, in fact, I'll just play you the isolated vocal. I'll move my CTI back here and click play once more.
I don't care. I can just imagine.
Well, as Zach says, you can just imagine how good this is going to sound when we multi-track our audio files together, and perhaps we'll run some compression as well, just to even things out. Now if I come over to my isolated vocal and I'll mute that, and I'll move the CTI over here so that we can hear the studio recording, and I'll click play. Now I've actually forgotten to unmute this track, so I'll click stop and then click on here to unmute the audio track. Then of course now we will be able to hear it, so I'll click play once more. Okay, great stuff. Now you will have noticed that our studio recording there has been recorded quite loud, and in fact it's just peaking a little, so I do need to do something about that. I do need to bring its volume down. I could either do that with compression, which is what I'm going to do a little bit later on with our isolated vocal track. But if I added some compression to this studio recording, then I would start to lose some of the dynamics, seeing as it's already been mixed. So I'm probably not going to add any compression to this track, just the studio recording, but I will add some to our isolated vocal track. And you might notice down here on our track 3, for our isolated vocal, I've got the volume level playing back at -3 dB. I've only done that because this studio recording, just this section, has been optimized to peak its loudest point at 0 dB. So I want that a little bit quieter, so I've taken it down to -3 dB, only because you'll notice our studio recording comes in as the isolated vocal finishes off, and there is that overlap there, and so therefore just at that section, because we've got both audio tracks playing back at the same time, they might not peak or distort on their individual tracks, but they certainly will once they're routed out to the master output. Now you might notice I have created a fade at the end of the vocal track and a fade in just for our beginning of the studio recording, but even so, despite this, there will be, I'm sure, a little bit of distortion, which is something I would need to correct later on, prior to finishing this section and creating a final movie of it, ready for our biographical section on our DVD. And in fact, what I might do is I might just take its volume down. So I'm going to click in here for our studio recording and take this down to -1 decibels. So it's playing back its file volume at 1 dB under. That should help compensate for it. I still suspect I'll get a little bit of distortion, but I can play around with this a little bit later on. Right, I just want to check that my isolated vocal isn't too quiet. So let me just play it through. Here we go.
White Star rocket ships fill the air with the roar of drums and the sound of I don't care. I can just imagine what's going on in there.
Now I think that's okay in terms of being relative to the studio recording, so I'm possibly going to leave that as it is. But perhaps I will add some compression to it, just in case. And that's what we're going to look at in the next tutorial. We'll look at adding compression just to this isolated vocal track, rather than on the master output bus, which would squash the dynamics of our studio recording as well. So I'll just finish up here then, and I'll see you in a moment, when we're going to add in some compression.